Right, hey guys, how we doing? Back another video from Annie News, continuing with the Cuts content series for the Eminence in Shadow Season 2. This is for episode 6, I do believe. And I loved this episode. This episode was absolutely boss. And I loved that Delta was the first one that fought John Smith and just recognized him. But then I also thought it was cool that Alpha recognized him as well. And the fights were cool. And I just think the story is interesting. We got more backstory. But what was cut out? What was left out? What didn't we see? Let's find out.
Out of all the people that Sid has fought so far, Alpha may very well have been one of the most challenging for
Makes sense as well because she's the strongest, isn't she? And that thing she was doing where she was like turning into mist to go through the wires and keep fighting him was really cool.
him. The way she used mist form to
Yeah,
bypass
that's
Sid's
sick.
wires was the perfect counter to a weapon that utilized space. It had led to Sid being on the defensive for quite an impressive portion of
Cool. Alright, wow. That's boss.
the fight. They unfortunately didn't show this in the anime, but there were actually several instances in which Sid couldn't even dodge her attacks.
Ooh, that's interesting.
She was landing hits and making it seem like Sid was backed into a corner for once. So, if you want to see how exactly John Smith versus Alpha really went, along with Sid versus Delta and everything else in between, stick around as we'll go through all of it. Episode 26,
Or episode 6 of season 2.
John Smith, covering Chapter 6 and the epilogue from Volume 3 of the light novel.
I love everyone's talking about him now. John Smith. I've never heard of the name. It's
Picking
brilliant.
things up from right after John's humiliation of 664's squad, and Alpha was shocked to hear that all three of them together couldn't even touch him. Even 664 found herself humbled by the number of people whose strength far surpassed her own. Before, she'd taken the world for granted, but after losing her friends and family to circumstances we don't get to hear about, in exchange she had gained both truth and power. Before, she'd never even held a sword, yet here she was now powerful enough to defeat even the strongest of Dark Knights.
Hell yeah.
That's not to say she'd become cocky though, since the existence of the Seven Shadows made her aware that there would always be people she could never beat. The first was Alpha, whose power was unrivaled, and
God, she's so beastly though, Alpha. And Delta, I love Delta. I think Delta's my favorite out of all of them.
now it was John Smith who seemed to be equal to her. When Rose had interrupted to make that fact clear, surprisingly neither Gamma nor Alpha were upset by it.
No, they weren't bothered. They weren't phased, were they? Like, okay.
Instead, they said how they weren't here to scold them, commending them on the fact that they had made it back to report on it.
Oh, okay, cool.
So, with that being the trigger leading to Delta's deployment, a few days would pass before Sid would encounter her.
So cool when she's in the snow and she's just so cool. Delta's awesome.
In the meantime, his afternoons were spent mostly the same. He would don the identity of this super elite secret agent and protect the flow of counterfeits as they continued their way into circulation. Occasionally, he would go touch base with Yukime, but the bulk of his time as John Smith was spent protecting carriages.
Right.
It was while he was doing so on a night just like any other that a barely perceptible presence could be sensed approaching him. It was a presence that obviously belonged to an assassin, but the discreet nature of it meant that it could only belong to one person. You might not remember this from the last episode, but I did mention how Sid believed Delta to be the best at this type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The way she concealed her presence was second to no one.
Yeah.
That being the case, since the assassin approaching him was extremely difficult to detect, that meant the only person it could be was
Delta. Okay.
She was the only person he knew who could hide themselves like this.
She's so cool. Delta's awesome, man. I love the personality. It's just like, she's so
Initially, Sid believed Delta to be one of his best matchups, since the way he fights with wires is known to do well against, well, hot-blooded meatheads. All he would have to do is tie her down with the hidden ones, then that would be that and she wouldn't be able to move anymore. It was once Sid had thought about this matchup a second
Right, so it wasn't originally on a train
time
anyway,
though
okay.
that he quickly realized her traits as a therianthrope may put him at a disadvantage. You see, with instincts that were sharper than his own, there was a good chance that she could dodge his wires on intuition alone.
Wow.
It didn't matter whether she could see them or not, because there were a whole bunch of other factors making them detectable to her.
Cool.
So, with Sid now sure that that's what was going to happen, he truly believed that Delta was his worst matchup. So much so that he actually felt he may have to go full tryhard for once.
What?
It was the moment Delta had made her appearance, though, that one sniff was all that was needed for her to realize John Smith was Shadow.
I loved that. It's like, bah, she just changes straight away. Like, ah!
There wasn't even that little scuffle like how we saw in the anime. Sid was right in the middle of his introduction, and before he could even finish, Delta interrupted by asking to go hunting. She had exposed him fully with
straight away, love
zero
it.
doubts whatsoever.
Oh, Delta.
So, despite Sid having taken a bath and doused himself in perfume, Delta's nose was still able to sniff right through it, leaving Sid no choice but to take his mask off and reveal himself. A minor outtake that needs to be mentioned is the simple action that had led to Delta's hair being left here. It was the result of Delta trying to run off and report to Alpha. Sid didn't want her doing that, so before she could get too far and break out into a sprint, he had grabbed her tail and told her to wait, resulting in several tufts of her hair falling out in the process.
Oh, okay. That's brilliant. Okay. Oh, I love checking these cut content videos out.
This would be the hair that Shadow Garden would find after, and it's that bit of evidence which would serve as the proof that she was defeated. As for the reason why Shadow didn't want her reporting back to Alpha, well, it was mainly because of how bad of an actor she was. Sure, Delta could keep his secret no problem, but her inability to do so confidently would, without a doubt, lead to him getting exposed immediately. It was much safer to just send her far away so that no one could track her.
Yeah.
Or, at the very least, it would take them a while to. With that being the extent
That was a good thing after the credits, where it's just to like, ah!
of Sid versus Delta, it was the reveal of Delta's fate that would make Alpha almost as bereaved as Gamma was. She had known that something like this was inevitable, so it was just unfortunate that today happened to be the day for it. I mean, it really was only a matter of time until they lost somebody. Shadow Garden's missions were always risky,
Very dangerous, jeez.
and with Delta being the strongest out of all of them, it was only natural that she handled the most dangerous ones. That being the case, her not coming back almost
The way that she cracked the window doing this was so cool.
certainly meant that she was dead. It was just the general nature of the missions that she was sent on. Once this conversation had switched over to John Smith, the realization that his plan extended to beyond that of a simple cash grab made her believe him to be this incredible genius. To her, the plan he had come up with was flawless. It was as if he predicted everything before it could even happen.
And he's just winging it. It's brilliant. He is proper Einsing it right now.
Around the same time that Alpha was praising John Smith's intellect, so too would Getten be doing the same. To him, this counterfeit ploy was also the work of a genius. Rather than attribute it to John Smith alone, though, he assumed the plan had to be carried out through an organization.
I'm intrigued as well. There was a moment that happened in the flashback where the woman with the tails was talking about what happened with her and Getten. And then you just hear for a second this voice shouting. I think a funny reveal is going to be that he got his eye slashed by Sid when he was younger, when he was doing his little, he put the bag on his head and did all that. I think that's going to be a reveal, because Sid seems to have just been affected, has affected everything unintentionally as he's been going. I think that's going to be a reveal. I'm just putting that out now before we get down the line.
Sure, the person who made it definitely had the mind of a steel trap,
And that's
but
why
what
Getten
they
has
also
not
needed
met
was
John
extensive
Smith
funds,
yet.
extensive manpower, and incredibly deep knowledge of credit creation. Since no person could possibly possess all of that, Getten assumed the plan was the work of Mitsugoshi. He believed Mitsugoshi to have caught on to the plan to bankrupt them, and as a result prepared the only possible solution for it.
Because he did mention that in the last episode, though, as well, didn't he? That he thought that maybe because he was about to do something, and then they started doing this before he was able to jump in.
If they were able to gather enough funds before the bank runs happened, then with the amassed gold, they alone would be the ones to survive it. So what better way to do that than to gather funds through counterfeits? By manufacturing them and liquidating them into the economy, Getten figured Mitsugoshi would have raised enough capital to weather the bank runs. To him, he assumed that they had seen right through him. The reason he was able to come to this conclusion was because the messengers the cult had sent simply came to inform him of that. They weren't there to threaten his position or criticize his work, but rather simply tell him that the counterfeits in the market weren't theirs.
Right.
It was a crucial bit of news that made him furious.
Wow, that looks really cool. That's some cool art, that.
This wasn't because he was losing at a game he thought he was winning, but was instead because death was certain if he did lose. In fact, Getten knew he would be lucky if all the cult did was kill him. Like, to have the MCA fall was one thing, but to have the cult lose all their assets in the process, all while giving Mitsugoshi a monopoly over the marketplace, well, that was something that the cult definitely wouldn't stand for. So, as panic overwhelmed his entire body, Getten's only solution came in the form of finding John Smith.
Right. Well, yeah, of course, it has to.
If he could, then the counterfeits were sure to be nearby. Then, if he could find the counterfeits, he could recover the liquidated funds and save the cult's assets. There was still time for him to salvage all of this. When we get to the next scene with Alexia, this whole encounter was actually original to the anime. There was something similar to it in the web novel, but the topic of their discussion was vastly different.
Cool.
You see, Alexia had actually intended to track Iris down here. She had been hearing rumors of the bank's imminent bankruptcy and had rushed to the capital in order to tell Iris about it. She felt it was a matter that needed to be investigated immediately. For Iris, who was currently in the middle of training though, such news wasn't important at all. She actually couldn't even be bothered to care for it. The only thing that mattered to her right now was getting stronger in order to capture Shadow. That was the only way she felt she could gain the people's trust again.
Mundane, man. Wow. What a story arc.
So, as she ignored Alexia to go back to her training, it was the way that Iris swung her sword that just seemed ugly. Something about her practice just didn't appeal to Alexia anymore. Beta's meeting with Shadow was pretty much the same, so that brings us to the much anticipated fight between John Smith and Alpha.
So funny though when he's like writing stuff down. She's like, what is it? And he's just like writing it. What was it? Because he had the window open and he's like, note to self, it's too cold. And then he sneezes as well. So funny. I love the little comedic moments in between the seriousness and everything. I feel like Eminence in Shadow is really well done. Like, it's boss. There are people out there that just, I think someone left a comment one time when I started doing the Eminence in Shadow stuff, and they were like, oh, we've lost another one. It's like, no, it's actually a really good anime. The pacing's boss. The animation is incredible. The fights are boss. And then the story's really interesting, and the comedic moments are just, they're not overpowering when it comes to the whole grand scheme of it. It just, when it hits, it's really funny. Anyway, sorry,
I honestly wasn't expecting this when the season had started, but a fight like this is something I'm completely here for.
Yes.
I don't think we'll ever get another instance of Sid versus Shadow Garden, so might as well enjoy this one to the fullest while we can.
Heck yeah, as soon as Delta jumped in, I was like, whoa, here we go. And then Alpha jumps up, so what?
It was yet another one of those nights when Sid was protecting the counterfeits that a large group of men would stop his carriage for inspection. The search itself was very much illegal, but with the MCA panicking due to their approaching bankruptcy, pretty much every member of Garter's private army had been mobilized for this. They were going after every carriage that looked even remotely suspicious. It was as Garter's men would reach to unveil this carriage's curtains that a stern voice would warn them not to.
Ooh.
The men naturally mocked the voice as if to say it was an empty threat, but the moment that curtain was lifted, the man who had done so was immediately decapitated.
Whoa.
John Smith would then appear behind all of them, recite the catchphrase he'd been diligently working on, then quickly decapitate the rest just as easily.
Harbinger
Not a single person
Reaver.
had even realized what it was that killed them. The carriage would then proceed like nothing had happened, but John, however, would stay behind and call out into the darkness.
Oof.
It was apparent that a much stronger
He
threat
knows
was
he's being
stalking
watched.
him.
Nice.
Alpha would then engage the exact same way we saw in the anime, but rather than get blocked with a myriad of wires, she would just straight up miss as the target she was going for was actually John's afterimage.
Oof.
This revelation had come as quite a shock because, despite knowing John Smith was strong enough to defeat even Delta, she never expected him to be this strong. From this single move, the level of power he'd displayed was beyond even her expectations. The way he moved at high speeds by compressing magical energy, that was a skill that required incredibly precise magic control. That and magic circuits capable of withstanding such a burden.
You see, like, I would have thought Alpha would have been dead stupid if she didn't clock on that it was Shadow. So I was very happy that she did clock on that it was him. Pretty fast as well, so it'd be interesting to see how quickly she clocks on in the originals way it was told.
So, Alpha was definitely intrigued as to how someone like him had learned that, but the luxury of conversation wasn't something John was permitting right now. What he presented instead was a barrage of wires heading straight towards her. The thing is, since Alpha was already aware of the way that John Smith fights, She had used that knowledge to discern where all of his hidden wires were. She had sensed all the smaller, thinner ones beforehand. By knowing exactly where they were, she was able to navigate the maze that John Smith had created and close the distance between herself and him in an instant, following it up with an attack that went straight for his throat. Alpha had timed this in a way she knew dodging was impossible, yet with the slightest tilt of his head, John Smith had done just that. He had evaded her undodgeable attack with the most minute movement.
Wow.
John would then counter with another barrage of wires, but Alpha would do the same thing and find an opening between them. She would then follow it up with an attack even more precise than the last, but even that still wasn't enough somehow. Despite being perfect to the point of impact, her blade just wouldn't make contact as it would practically slide over John Smith's skin. It was a meticulous approach to combat that she knew only one person could pull off. So, as she called out John Smith for who he really was, Sid would go on to explain nothing. He would simply state that he was John Smith now and that whatever he was doing was the best option.
Yeah,
It was the way Alpha professed her confusion after this that whole speech about wanting to support him would be reminiscent of this. Obviously not to the same extent, but that essence of not understanding was very similar. The core takeaway from what Alpha was saying was that she didn't want Shadow to always be leaving her behind. She didn't want him to think that she couldn't support him. Her and everyone else have always been trying to catch up to him, but no matter how fast they run, Sid's always acting like he doesn't need them. So to see him here now actively acting against them, well, that was a devastating realization enough to make Alpha cry. Where we get to what I think is the biggest difference from the fight is Alpha's masterful use of Mist Form to effectively beat John Smith. Now, that's not to say that she beat Sid in a fight, but she did force him to have to use his sword, something we know he was actively trying to avoid here.
Yeah, okay.
As for how Sid was forced into that, well, whenever he would try to dodge and counter the same way he did before, Alpha would have already struck and turned to mist by the time that he could.
Whoa.
She would vanish and reappear at a speed he was surprisingly struggling
So
to
she does a
keep
better
up with.
job in the...
Small cuts and tears would then start to appear.
I think, yeah, that was the anime. I think what the anime's tried to do is just show that he is completely, like, above them all, and they don't have a chance, whereas this is, like... I mean, yeah, he's holding back, but still, Alpha's getting more hits in on the original, so... Yeah, it's like, the Invincible series, the way Omni-Man defeats the Guardians of the Globe. In the comic, he doesn't struggle whatsoever. He absolutely just boom. But I think to try and show that the Guardians of the Globe were actually, like, you know, something, they made... The fight ended the same way, but it was more of a struggle in the comics. No, in the comics it was easier. In the cartoon, they made it seem like Omni-Man struggled a bit.
On Sid's face and suit, and that would make it seem like Alpha was actually winning for a bit. Whether or not that was true, it was definitely clear that she had the advantage right now. Not only were her attacks so incredibly one-sided, but the combination of an offense that defied space, together with a defense that bent the laws of physics, was so oppressive that it had actually surprised Sid. The way she vanished, then appeared, and appeared, then vanished was
very
overall
cool.
just a really bad matchup for him. Specifically his John Smith persona and his use of wires. Since the wires were used to manipulate space against his opponent, they were effectively useless against an opponent who could override the concept of space altogether.
You know,
Not to mention the fact that this mist also doubled as some form of sensory organ. What this meant was that, in addition to all the other stuff that I just mentioned, Alpha could also sense every wire's movements too. Whatever part of her mist would be touching them, she would know where they were and where they were heading, all while not even being corporeal. So, as 3 more slashes would make contact, Sid's suit would be ripped to shreds now.
Oh.
The only reason none of these attacks were fatal was because his movements and wires were just barely enough to prevent them from killing him. It was right as Alpha would go for the finishing blow that she would call out one more time, begging to let her support him. She was hoping all this would have proved that she was strong enough now. She obviously didn't want to hurt him, but if that was the only way to show that she wasn't a burden anymore, Alpha was fine doing what needed to be done here. Now, Sid obviously wasn't going to let anyone beat him, so right as Alpha's sword was about to hit, he would materialize his own and do one massive swing with it.
Whoa.
The released magic combined with the immense force of the wind was enough to end the fight just like that. Any and all mist was immediately dispersed into the stratosphere. In fact, had Alpha stayed in her mist form any longer, the end result likely would have been fatal for her.
Oh no, wow.
So, As Sid would compliment her on how strong she'd become, he would knock her out using the flat side of his sword, then leave her behind as if to say nothing had changed,
Damn.
bringing an end to an amazing fight between two of the world's strongest characters. But yeah,
Well, they
that's
are,
pretty much
they
it for this cut content.
Oh, well, damn.
I hope Sid's disregard for Alpha doesn't make you hate him, but I will admit it was pretty harsh of him.
Yeah, it was a bit
Other
harsh.
than that, this whole clash with Shadow Garden was probably some of my favorite from Eminence and Shadow.
Sick.
Let me know what you guys thought down in the comments. Did you like this arc, or did you prefer some of the other ones instead? Anyway,
I'm
as
enjoying
always,
the
thank
John
you so much
Smith
for
arc,
watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time.
Ciao. Yeah, no, I thought that episode was boss. I'm really, really loving the John Smith arc. I think it's class. I think it's so funny, and it's just so simple, and it's very, like he said in the last one, Overlord-esque, where like he thinks he knows what he's doing, but then it's playing out even better, and everyone's like, oh my god, John Smith's this cool guy, and he's like, oh, okay. And the fights with Shadow Garden are cool, and I feel like we're going to have more of the world building going on, because he sent Delta to go after Juggernaut now, who was in the Lawless City, who was the big buffy guy. We're going to get stuff on Getten. I'm calling it now. Sid gave Getten the scar in his eye, because he didn't have the scar in his eye when he killed Thingy's mom and then sliced her in the back. When he turned around, we heard a voice. I reckon that was Sid. So calling it. Thanks to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, links and descriptions to the Patreon page. $1 a month is the last post. That's greatly appreciated. Thank you for that, and thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe, and leave comments down below. Let me know what I should watch, discuss in future videos. See you guys next time.